Welcome, everyone. We'll give it another minute or two to let others join. Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Lean. I am the Program Director for America's All In. Thank you so much for joining this call today. We have some really wonderful speakers who are going to walk through the climate and clean energy impacts from the recently enacted so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We will be recording today's webinar and are setting aside time at the end for your questions. Please submit those questions throughout the session. We may have panelists able to answer them as they go, but we will have a Q&A session at the very end. The impacts from this legislation are wide-ranging and eliminates much of the clean energy policy tax credits and grant programs from the Inflation Reduction Act. However, there are still federal and state financing opportunities that remain, and that's what we want to really focus on in today's conversation. We want to find the positive path forward as we strive to deliver on our climate commitments. So let me first go to our initial speaker. I'd like to introduce America's All In Managing Co-Chair Gina McCarthy. One of the nation's most respected voices on climate change, the environment, and public health, she served as the first White House National Climate Advisor and as U.S. EPA Administrator. As head of the Climate Policy Office under President Biden, McCarthy's leadership led to the most aggressive action on climate in U.S. history, reflected in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Gina, thank you for joining us and sharing your experience and advice for how to push forward in this critical moment.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks everybody for being here and for making it so clear that enough is enough. We will not allow this administration to speak for us or to dictate our future. It is heartbreaking for me, and I'm sure all of you, to see the endless string of steps this administration's EPA is taking to avoid doing its job, the job that EPA was actually created to do, which is to protect people and the environment from unchecked pollution. This administration's EPA is tossing aside the climate science our government has relied on for decades, and in doing so, they put our health safety at risk while ratcheting up grid instability, energy bills, and disaster costs. This administration's decision to deny our ability to move forward and deny the sound science and revoke the longstanding endangerment finding on climate change does nothing but significantly diminish the federal regulatory authority framework that all of us, states, cities, local communities, businesses, and business people all across the country have relied on for decades to protect health, our environment, and well-being. Simply put, we're facing huge challenges, and we can no longer continue to turn aside or allow this administration to dictate our future. Simply put, we have to lead us into a cleaner, safer, healthier, more secure future, not by relying on the federal government, but relying on all of us. Look, for as long as I can remember, climate work has never been easy. We have to move forward to develop a cleaner, safer, healthier, and more secure future. And we'll do that if we all buckle up. We're in for a bumpy ride for sure, but climate work, again, has never been for the faint of heart. I have never been one to back down from a challenge that threatens the health and safety of my kids and grandkids, and I'm sure you feel the same. And the fact that you're here today speaks volumes about how much we all want to continue to work together. Look, Over the past decade, we've turned technologies into tools that have strengthened our economy, delivered good paying union jobs, cleaned up our air and water, conserved our precious natural resources, and saved families money all across the country. That's what I mean by working together. If we do, we will thrive together. As we speak, states and institutions are fighting in court to stop efforts that take away our right to clean air and water. Folks are speaking up at neighborhood gatherings, town halls, public hearings to make sure that we demand sound science and how we can work together to protect our communities from the ravages of a changing climate. We have to stay strong. We have to stand up and protect our families, our communities, and our democracy. Folks, this call is not about wallowing in defeat. It's about grabbing the opportunities we have today to move our country forward again. Does the president's obsession with fossil fuel blind his administration from making smart decisions? Of course it does. Did Congress vote against our ability to move forward and actually take the bulls by the horn together? Of course it did. But that doesn't mean we give up. What it means is we stand up. Look, as we speak, we know we can work together. We have to work together. That's how the United States has always worked. So let's not be anything but hopeful. Let's keep in mind that 84% of corporations are standing by their commitments to cut carbon pollution. They understand that now's the time to be smart, to stay competitive, to meet rising demand, to stop energy bills from spiking and tackle aging infrastructure. How are we going to do all that? By working together to advance clean energy, batteries, and energy efficient solutions that are already available and affordable now. So look, let's stay hopeful. Let's not forget that all of us, states, cities, local communities, still have authority. We can act boldly, and we are. So we're going to work with industries to meet energy demand, create jobs, lower the cost of living for families. We still have tax credits for wind and solar and batteries and geothermal and hydro and nuclear. These credits represent huge opportunities for utility scale development. So we are in a moment in time when we must work together, and we will. And today's effort to talk this through will make us bolder and more hopeful than ever before. Thanks very much for everything that all of you are doing. And let me turn it back now and make sure that we all continue to work together. Elizabeth, you're back.
Gina, thank you. I think we're all buckled up, ready to go, lean in, and really make sure that we will not be leaning back during this moment. So I appreciate your words. I'd now like to introduce Elisa Peterson. Elisa is a manager with RMI, where she oversees the federal policy program. Her expertise covers carbon-free buildings, renewables, and sustainable urbanization. Elisa, thank you for being with us. And could you speak to what federal incentives remain and what subnational actors can do to push for enhanced action?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with just kind of high-level overview of what the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA, actually did. The first thing it did was it largely changed all the tax credits. Some tax credits changed more than others, but as Gina McCarthy just said, none of them are gone yet. They're all still available. They're just phasing out a little quicker than originally planned. The other positive thing that happened within this bill is that it did not try to rescind any obligated funding. So, and the bulk of funding, grant funding, actually was obligated. 90% of the grant funding was obligated. Now that 10% that was unobligated did get rescinded within the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It's important to note that you might be thinking, well, some of this funding is obligated, but my contracts are still getting terminated. That is happening in some instances at the agency level, but this particular bill did not touch obligated grant funding, which was a win. So going through kind of the tax credits, let's start with the consumer tax credits. These are all phasing out within the year, some of them with different timelines. The electric vehicle tax credits are phasing out the quickest, September 2025. So in the next few months, if you're thinking about getting an electric vehicle, now is definitely the time. For the EV charging tax credit, that phases out after June 2026. For the energy efficiency and clean energy residential tax credit, that phases out at the end of the year. And then for the new construction of residential homes, that's June 2026. And for commercial buildings, that is after that phases out after June 2026. So all within a year, most of those tax credits are going away. I'm not going to cover this one in too much detail because we actually have a full deep dive on the renewable tax credits. But what I want to just highlight here is that the renewable tax credits are for commercial projects. They phase out a little bit later. Projects need to be placed in service by the end of 2027. And for residential projects that do third-party ownership, they actually qualify under this tax credit. And so even though on first glance it appears like the residential solar tax credits goes away by the end of the year, if you think about kind of innovative financing, there's an opportunity for an extension there. Another, I would say, largely bright spot is that the advanced manufacturing production tax credit it still remains. The main update that happened was when components are going to be phased out earlier, 2027. And then there's also new foreign entity of concern requirements. We're going to get some more guidance on that next month, but that essentially will mean that taxpayers can't be foreign entities of concern, and where you get your materials for these projects can't be manufactured in foreign entities of concern. And then the industrial decarbonization tax credits also fared pretty well. Carbon capture remained in place, existing nuclear remained in place, sustainable aviation fuel actually got extended a couple years. And then the clean hydrogen tax credit is the one kind of exception to this. It got repealed so that projects need to start construction by 2027, which should impact quite a bit of the current planned clean hydrogen pipeline. So with kind of this new reality, we're also facing new economics. Under IRA, we kind of had this interesting situation where clean energy almost beat out fossil fuels like every single time. Now it's a little bit more nuanced. Once the tax credits go away, we need to be more thoughtful about which projects we're pushing to make sure that we're still including affordability. And in the places where maybe the economics don't pencil as well, we need to really think about opportunities for new incentive or new financing. So we did kind of a preliminary analysis looking at residential applications. And what we found was for heat pumps, they're still cost effective for most electric resistance, fuel, oil, and propane homes. For solar, they're still cost effective for most states with high electricity rates. And for electric vehicles, they're still cost effective in most states with low electricity rates for SUVs and sedans. So I think this is actually an important point because, you know, after this bill passed, I think there was a big question of like, okay, can clean energy even compete anymore? And I think the answer is yes, it can sometimes. And like, let's make sure we figure out what times it can and really deploy there. And so I'll wrap up with what subnational actors can kind of do in this moment to get the most out of, you know, really squeeze the rest out of the clean federal clean energy incentives, as well as think through actions they can take beyond the federal incentives to not be as reliant on kind of what the federal government is offering. So the first thing is we can do education on tax credit deadlines and potentially create one-stop shops so that you're pulling together all the local incentives in one place. maybe all the local incentives can't fill the gap fully of the federal incentives, but at least it kind of gets you partially the way there. You could also add new incentives that fill the gap that get you the full way there. I mentioned that the grant program still remains, so most states are going to be launching their home energy rebate programs if they haven't already, as well as solar for all programs. Making sure that these are really successful and people know about them is going to help kind of like cushion the fall of losing out on some of these tax credits. This is a good opportunity to think about streamlining permitting processes for two reasons. One, because the tax credits are terminating quickly, so the faster we can get projects deployed, the more projects are going to take advantage of the tax credits. But also, we know that our soft costs are some of the highest across a bunch of different countries. And so if we can do things like lower the soft cost, maybe that will help fill some of the gap of losing out on the tax credits. We can also work with green banks to make sure their offerings are updated to make sure that they kind of reflect the new reality. And also think about organizing things like bulk procurement, like a Solarize campaign, which we know can also reduce the cost and potentially fill a little bit of that gap. If you're not a state and local government, I think there's still things that you can do to be effective in this time. The first is to do your homework. Make sure you know when these tax credits are ending and what that actually means. Does it mean, okay, I need to purchase this equipment by this time? Do I need to place it in service by this time? Do I need to start construction by this time? Like, make sure you really know and accelerate those projects when possible to get within that threshold. Also, make sure you're kind of letting your contractors know that you're planning to move projects forward. My assumption is that we're going to see a big push to complete projects to get within the deadline. And so I would not wait to start the project because I think people are going to be very busy. You can also identify state, local, and utility incentives. Hopefully the states are creating these one-stop shops that I talked about on the last slide, but if they're not, do your own research to try to fill some of those gaps. And then also subnational actors can also organize bulk procurement or think through innovative financing. So you can definitely work with your local governments, but you don't necessarily need them to do some of these actions on your own. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity still here to get the most out of these incentives. And I know as subnational actors, the America is All In Coalition, these are the folks that are able to step up. And so I'm excited to see what you all are going to do. And with that, I will pass it back to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. That was really great, very informative, and I really appreciate you getting into that level of detail. I'd now like to be able to bring in the next speaker who will be able to expand on these impacts and sort of give a view of what this is going to mean for the broader economy. Ethan Zindler currently leads country and policy research at Bloomberg NEF, a provider of data, research, and analysis on the transition to a lower carbon economy. Prior to this role, Ethan served as climate counselor to the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and was charged with leading Treasury's efforts to achieve a net zero economy. Ethan, thank you for joining us and sharing findings of recent modeling and research BNF has done on the policy and tax credits changes of the bill. Over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and great to see you and see everybody else. Hopefully you can see some slides. Elizabeth, can you see those?
We sure can. Yep.
All right. Well, thanks very much. It's great to be with you all today and to talk to you a little bit about the implications of the Big Beautiful Bill Act. The new law really has many implications for every segment of clean energy, from home energy efficiency to electric vehicle charging, hydrogen, and other technologies. For the sake of today's conversation, though, I'm going to focus my remarks specifically on what it will mean for the build out of new renewable power and batteries. there are a lot of different things we could talk about, but combined, these technologies have really had, I think, the greatest impact to date on helping to reduce U.S. CO2 emissions overall. And then, of course, during the Q&A, I'm happy to try and answer whatever questions folks have, maybe about some of the other technologies. And thanks so much, Elisa, for that great presentation to kind of as a good lay down of kind of like what this bill actually entailed. So I'm going to talk, like I said, a little bit about the power sector, but I think it's important to offer just a little bit of context on where we are in terms of transitioning the power sector overall before we get into a discussion of the implications of this new law. First of all, it's worth noting that the U.S. power sector has been rapidly decarbonizing over the last 15 years. As recently as 2014, coal accounted for about 40% of all of our electricity, and today it's about 15%. You can see the red bit of this chart, which is nuclear, stayed steady at about 20% over that time. And then, of course, gas has grown from about 30% to about 43%, and then renewables has doubled from about 12% to 24%. That's the blue, the top chunk that you see there. And most of that additional capacity has been really wind and solar overall. If you then look at this, though, in terms of terawatt hours, the actual electricity units. The reason I'm showing you this is just to make the point that the two charts look pretty similar, except for the one thing you'll notice that's different on the right when we look at the actual raw numbers is in the last several years, for the two observations. First, that this chart's pretty flat. We actually really haven't seen much growth in electricity demand in the United States in quite a long time. But if you look carefully at those last several bars, you'll see that the total amount of electricity demand has been starting to tick up just in the last couple of years. And that is an important trend and important context to put around the passage of this bill, because while I would argue that this legislation is probably really, some of the worst news that the clean energy sector could have received, it's actually coming at not the worst possible time in terms of market development. And I'll explain what I mean by that as I go forward here. Then the main, one of the main reasons for that is that we are now on the verge of seeing a very sharp uptick in demand for electricity coming from data centers, many of which related to the proliferation of AI going forward. For some context, as recently as 2016, the US had 10 gigawatts of data center capacity online. To give us, for those who don't live and breathe in gigawatts, the U.S. has something around about 1,300 gigawatts in total online on the grid today, but only about 10 of that in 2016 related to data centers. If you roll the clock forward and you look at the 2025 bar, and by the way, these are just split by power markets, you can see that we were up over 40 gigawatts by 2025. And then if you look forward, this is our projection to 2035, we think you're going to get to somewhere close to 80 gigawatts. So you're seeing a very sharp increase overall going forward. We also at Bloomberg NEF think that there'll be a good deal of additional demand coming from electric vehicles as well. And before I move off the slide, I would just note that our projections in terms of data center demand are probably some of the lowest out there. If you look at some of the projections from some of the consulting companies and others, they have much higher projections for how much electricity is going to be required. So the bottom line is we need more electricity generation on the grid. And there's a lot of discussion in Washington about how that could potentially come from natural gas-fired power plants. We certainly have an abundance of natural gas in the United States. What we do not have is an abundance of turbines that can be used to convert that gas into electricity. In fact, there's a real squeeze in that market. And so despite the fact that there's been a lot of discussion in Washington about wanting to promote fossil fuel generation, we think it's going to be kind of tough to do, which still leaves room for renewables. And I'll get into in a minute about what that means in terms of the actual deployment that we see of these technologies. But just a quick note here about the legislation itself, the law itself. And I thought Elisa did a great job giving really an overview of the whole thing. And it's going to be impossible for me to kind of walk through every last detail of what you're seeing here. But this is the timeline for the U.S. tax credit qualification for utility scale solar and wind projects by start date. let me just talk it through at a super high level. I don't want to get too far in the details, but it does actually matter a lot, the details. So at the very highest level, just looking at the green boxes that you can see here, this is the period really through the end of this calendar year where we believe that projects that get under construction and can then get completed as late as 4 years from now. And I say believe because there's a potential major wrinkle to all of this, potentially coming from the White House and the Treasury Department, really within the next really about the next month or so. The pink is from the end of 2025 this year up until the end of 2027. This is a period where we think projects can qualify for credits, but they are going to have to meet some pretty stringent new foreign entity of concern rules that Elisa mentioned earlier. And again, I'm not going to try to walk you through all of these, but these are essentially rules that prohibit these projects from using equipment that is made in China. Other countries as well, but really the aim is on China. And then, of course, from 2027 on, this is the world in which basically projects, for the most part, are going to have to get online without qualifying for any tax credits. And to be clear, there will still be stuff built even without tax credits. And I'll come on to that in just a moment. So this is a look at our forecast, and it's now our revised view. We'd actually put something out earlier after the House had passed legislation. As I said earlier, I would note that even though the law is now final, there remains some pretty important known unknowns, if you will, that require us to caveat this forecast slightly, and I'll come on to that in a sec. But first, let's look at where we think things go through the next few years. Long story short, through 2027, we actually do not expect a collapse in the build of clean power projects in the United States. In fact, we anticipate a bit of front loading, if you will, as projects that can potentially accelerate their development timelines are going to do so. The black line that you see on this chart is the forecast that we produced last spring before really the action really began and got underway on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The stack bars now represent our current view, and you can see we've stacked them up by yellow, which is solar, blue, which is wind, pink, which is storage. And you'll see that for 2025, we now expect build really to track very closely to about the 70 gigawatts of capacity we were expecting was going to get built this year. We do know that some projects already have been delayed, but we still think we're pretty confident that this year this is where you'll land. Then next year, interestingly enough, you can see that we actually expect build to track a bit above what we were earlier projecting, and all the build rate actually through 2027 tracks slightly ahead of the 3-year time frame that we were looking at. So you may look at this and say, oh, wow, okay, this doesn't look so bad. What's the big deal? Kind of looks like business as usual. But I think it's important to note that beneath the surface of this chart, there's a lot that's actually going on, which is that we expect to see an enormous amount of, as I said, front loading of projects trying to move earlier to get built. And this we think is going to put a lot of squeeze and cost pressure on supply chains. And then things change quite dramatically in 2028 as we reach the end of the road for the tax credits for most projects. From 2027 to 2028, we expect the market to contract by about 40% as those projects that could qualify for the credits get them. And then from 2028 on, the vast majority of what gets built is going to be without tax credits entirely for the most part. And I know some might say, okay, well, why doesn't this just drop down to zero? As Elisa really alluded to, first, the cost of these technologies have been dropping for years, and we anticipate that to continue going forward. We expect that both upstream, where solar and battery prices have historically demonstrated strong learning rates, where cost drop, we think that's going to continue. But downstream, we also expect the U.S. industry will achieve efficiencies that it's not seen to date. We certainly have seen in other countries around the world when subsidies are removed, industries can get quite efficient in terms of cost cutting, and I think that's something that's going to happen pretty aggressively here. It's not going to be, frankly, necessarily comfortable for a lot of folks in the industry. It certainly inevitably will lead probably to some job losses, but it is a reality and something that has occurred earlier. And the second reason why we think build will continue, of course, is what I was showing earlier, which is that demand is rising from data centers and also from electric vehicles. And that demand's got to get met somehow. And these technologies continue to be low-cost providers. And then, of course, the reason I also mentioned earlier, which is that it's pretty much impossible in the short run to get your hands on a new natural gas-fired power turbine. And so adding a lot of new gas capacity isn't really going to come from there. One last thing I would just note before moving off this slide is that look, the tax credits as they've been on the books, if you think about them, essentially socialize a discounted cost of electricity for American consumers by creating this tax credit. If you remove those that socialized subsidy, effectively what the result will be is higher power prices because these projects to get built are going to need to pencil out for the developers. And in a number of cases, we anticipate we're going to see higher priced power purchase agreements signed between project owners and consumers. And so it is inevitable this is going to put real pressure on pricing going forward. As I mentioned earlier, the passage of the bill had many complex implications for clean power, which I kind of talked through at a higher level earlier. I also mentioned there was one additional wrinkle, and that wrinkle came a few days after the law passed when the White House issued an executive order telling the Treasury Department to explicitly issue rules pertaining to how a project is defined as under construction and when it must be completed after that construction begins. The White House also told Treasury to write new rules pertaining to the foreign entity provisions that Elisa mentioned earlier. Like I said, this adds a real level of complexity to the market, as many in the industry don't exactly know what the final rules of the road actually are going to be. Of course, it complicates my life too, as someone who tries to think about forecasting what's going to be happening going forward. So the sort of in the name of being transparent here, I thought I'd share with you a few different perspectives that we produced in terms of sort of the level of variability of what could happen going forward. So first, on the left-hand side is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that forecast that we put out last spring. It shows about 512 gigawatts of build of new wind, solar, and battery storage all the way through 2030. Again, for context, there's about 1,300 gigawatts of capacity online in the United States at the moment. And then the next chunk over is the base case, and that's the chart that I was showing earlier. And it shows about a little under 400 gigawatts of capacity. So, you know, roughly about a 23% reduction from what we would have been expecting otherwise. We tried to be kind of conservative here in doing this, and we assumed that projects would still get 4 years to get built online. But we also thought that the Treasury Department was going to make some moves that was going to make it harder for wind and solar projects to comply with the foreign entity rule, because the White House has signaled pretty strongly that that's what they would like to see Treasury do. We also sought to model what we call an upside case, in which Treasury does not significantly make it harder for projects to comply with the foreign entity rule. And in our view, we think this would lead to a much smaller decline in build of just about 50 gigawatts less than what we've been expecting. You would still see about 460 gigawatts. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we model what we call as a downside case, in which Treasury makes it harder to comply with the foreign entity rules. Wind and solar projects must get under construction by year-end 2025, and they only get 2 years to get built. And interestingly, this last scenario is actually not that much worse than the base case that we modeled. And part of the reason for that is because solar projects actually can get built fairly quickly in less than 2 years anyway. One really important note on all four of these scenarios, which is that if you look at that pink chunk at the top, that's our projection for utility scale battery storage. And this, I think, is one of the sort of squirreliest parts of this whole thing to predict. The tax credits for batteries, for large scale batteries, last into the 2030s. So that's the good news, certainly for the industry. The less good news is that the industry also faces substantial foreign entity restrictions on those batteries. And in many cases at the moment, large-scale battery projects really are contingent on Chinese-made equipment. And I think some others in the industry have voiced real concern that battery build is going to really drop as a result of this. I guess I would put us in the somewhat less concerned camp. I think we feel pretty good that there's some availability of imports from overseas, from non-China countries that can be helpful. We think that that supply of batteries on U.S. soil is going to rise thanks to all the build out of manufacturing capacity we've seen. And then there's a third element, which is that because of an entirely different aspect of the legislation, we think that there's actually going to be less electric vehicles sold in the United States. And those EVs would have used a number of these same batteries. And so we think that that makes more batteries available for utility scale energy storage overall. And then finally, we also think there'll be a fair amount of grouping of large scale battery projects along with solar to qualify for the tax credit. I'm going to close in just a second, but just a really quick observation before I do. We talked a lot here about deployment of these technologies. I think there's also a larger question about U.S. competitiveness in these technologies. Obviously, one of the intents of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 was to make the U.S. more competitive globally in the development, deployment, and even export of clean energy technologies. And it's hard to see how the passage of this new bill will not have some kind of major negative effect on that. There's no real one way to kind of measure this overall, but I'm showing this chart just for some context. Just looking purely in terms of dollars deployed, the US trailed China in 2024 in terms of investment with $818 billion, as you can see there for China, and about $338 billion deployed in the United States. And this was a very strong year for new investment in the US in terms of new clean energy technologies. If you try and look at that as a share of GDP, you can see that actually China fares even better. You can see about 4.5% of Chinese GDP went towards investment in these technologies, and ours was trending somewhere between 1 and I think 1.5%. That you can see that's the dot on the US. So we just haven't been making the same level of investment by comparison historically, although the numbers were rising. And if we look, we try and look forward and think sort of strategically about the US's position as a national producer and exporter of this, it's tough to see how this change isn't going to have some negative effect going forward, but of course we will have to see. So with that, let me just hand it back to Elizabeth, and then later happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Ethan. There is so much there, and I do actually have a lot of questions. I would welcome everyone who also has a couple of questions that they have about Ethan's presentation to please start putting them in the Q&A section. Now, what I would love to do is to introduce our final speaker, who is putting many of these ideas and concepts into practice in her community, particularly when it comes to things like geothermal power generation, which fared relatively well in the bill compared to some of the other technologies. She has valuable experience advancing climate and clean energy action in difficult policy environments. So let me now introduce Mayor Lauren McLean, who's serving her second term as mayor of Boise, Idaho, is the first woman elected to serve in this role in the city's 150-year history. She advocates for open space conservation, addressing housing and homelessness, and she has a commitment to bold climate action showcased by her efforts to pass Boise's 100% clean energy plan. We're proud to have the mayor as a member of America's All-In Leaders Circle, and I'd like to thank you for being with us, Mayor. Could you share how you've navigated a challenging state policy landscape there in Boise, what you're discussing with your fellow mayors about what's next, and particularly As Boise has one of the preeminent examples of geothermal infrastructure powering city operations in the country, what advice would you share to others who are trying to navigate this time?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Elizabeth. It's great to see you and others that were on this earlier. And I want to say I really appreciate the partnership that America's All In provides to me and to so many cities. I know businesses and others as well, but particularly in this time when we are navigating a different political landscape and mayors remain committed, I remain committed to making things on the ground work, regardless of the difficult situations. To have groups like America's All In, I work a lot with mayors through climate mayors. I'm the vice chair of climate mayors, is important because it helps us hone in on the things that we can do, what's within our control, and what our vision is, and then how we best do that in these challenging times. And I'd say that, you know, doing this work in Idaho, Boise is the capital city of Idaho, and I'm honored to serve as mayor of Boise. Doing this work in Idaho has kind of prepared me and others that work with me on my team and our residents in terms of knowing how best to work in these situations that we find ourselves in today. And we do that by finding ways, and I'm sorry, finding places where we agree, and then moving forward on those topics in particular together. And on that place of agreement, I'd say we have found that geothermal, an important solution for Boise's climate action plan and long-term resilience, it provides our city with clean heat, is a great place where right now with the constraints, with the changes to the IRA from the bill, I can actually work with my state legislators, my federal delegation, and others to advance our growing geothermal system. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that in particular, and I'm super excited and appreciate the opportunity to highlight the work that we've done. Boise has the largest municipal-owned geothermal system in the United States, and it's the oldest, if not one of the oldest, but I believe the oldest in the world. And today, just kind of paint a picture of what that means. It's direct source geothermal, and it provides, I'm sitting in a building that is heated with geothermal heat, but provides clean heat to over 90 buildings in our downtown. It's a 20-mile network of pipes through downtown that provides, as I mentioned, clean heat to businesses, to residents. It melts snowy sidewalks in the winter, and it even warms the pool at our downtown YMCA. Our management strategy for our geothermal system relies on a high level of stewardship. It's a closed loop system that re-injects the used water into the aquifer to recharge it to prevent depletion. And just this spring, actually, we were able to announce a donation of water rights from a holder of geothermal water rights, and it gives us the potential, we're gonna have to work with the state, but the potential to quadruple the amount of geothermal water we can use and quadruple the size of our system. And we have a long and complex and dynamic relationship with the local, state, and federal governments to bring clean heat to Boise. But we've been lucky enough to match the rising federal support in the last 5 years for local and renewable energy with our own efforts here to meet the growing needs. And we've got, to paint that picture, we've got 17 some buildings that are on a wait list. They want to tap into our clean heat system. And these partnerships that we're forging with the legislature, with the governor, with our delegation, have helped us meet the increased demand, but they're going to be really important in this political climate to allow us to expand the system and take advantage of the donation that we receive. And I wanted to highlight that when the IRA was passed and direct pay was a tool that was being used by so many cities, we were working really hard to have geothermal and direct source geothermal be included in that language. And I want to thank our Senator, Senator Mike Crapo, who with the 2025 tax bill, while it was being negotiated, worked to ensure that geothermal stayed within the bill that was passed, but also now allows direct pay reimbursement for geothermal, especially in our situation, by extending the sunset dates. And I'm pleased that it was protected in the bill because this is for us a very important part of our ability to decarbonize and to ensure that our city is prepared, our community is prepared and resilient into the future. And Elizabeth, you mentioned the challenging state policy landscape. You know, I look at this and it's just the lay of the land. We are the capital city of Idaho. It's how we work. It's because we must work in the landscape that we've got. And so as I mentioned, I focus on building coalitions among stakeholders. So in this case in particular, because we're using direct source geothermal for clean heat, water users are in this space. And so we're working with water users, with business leaders, with affordable housing developers even that want to see the systems extended and it provides me that opportunity to open doors and have a discussion about clean energy and clean energy policy, using a mechanism that so many folks in the state support. And so we are currently working on a state policy change that would allow us to continue to develop our water rights, to take advantage of that donation that we received to meet the growing business demand so that we could then heat more buildings. And I do also want to say, oh no, I'll save that actually, because right now we're working to expand our water right usage with the state policy work so that we can provide clean heat to more buildings. But we're also working with partners to figure out the feasibility of using our clean heat to then cool buildings in the future. Another important partner for us is at the local level, our redevelopment agency, because they're deploying tax increment financing to help us update the network when buildings are being built and to help us actually expand the network when we have that opportunity. And we've seen since 2020 alone a 26% growth in the system. Boiseans are really proud of the system. I'll kind of end with this. We're the most isolated city of our size in the country, and Boiseans are dedicated to meeting climate action goals and see this as not just a want to have, but a need to have, and they expect leadership. They also expect us to innovate, and it's not just you need to do this, Lauren. It is we want to help you do this too. And so we've got residents from throughout the city that are deeply proud of our system, that are rolling up their sleeves and wanting to be engaged when we have citizen engagement opportunities to talk about what the system looks like next. And in recent news, I'm so proud and was so thrilled to hear from the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge that our proposal in the City Ideas Challenge, where we would expand the system specifically to serve affordable housing that's been built on city land, that would look at new ways to charge for utilities in affordable multifamily ways, was accepted and listed as one of the 50 ideas as a finalist for the Mayor's Challenge in Bloomberg Philanthropies. And as I mentioned, while we're working on that, we're also working with another partner to look at the feasibility of taking our system and using it to cool into the future. And for us, we both have to take care of the system that we have. We've got to innovate from a funding space as well as a technology space to expand the system, because it's truly a clean heat, climate-friendly solution into the long run. So I did want to just say that if there's anybody here that's interested in learning more, this is doable. And our system is advanced because it's been around for a long time, but they're fledgling systems. And this is, especially with the way the bill was written, and the changes that were made, this is a place where cities ought to be taking a look and figuring out how you could take advantage of some of the changes related to geothermal in that bill when we're looking for cost-effective, climate-friendly heat and power solutions into the future. So if any of you are interested in partnering and learning more, I've got my public works team, other policy staff here, more than happy to connect you. Bree is on the call as well, as I believe. You can drop a line in the chat to her and she'll follow up. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to share what we're doing here in Boise, and look forward to learning and working alongside many of you to make sure that we do all we can at the city level to advance our residents' goals in the environment in which we find ourselves.
Mayor McLean, thank you so much. That was really sort of uplifting, and I'm really grateful for you taking the time to sort of walk through that with us. I think what is clear is that with the kind of climate leadership that you are providing, that, as you say, your constituents demand of you, you are able to sort of move things forward. So I would love our fellow panelists, if you don't mind, Ethan and Elisa, to come back on camera. I've got a couple of questions in the chat, and I've got a couple that I'm going to start with. Elisa, I'm coming your way first, if you don't mind. You'd mentioned a couple of innovative financing opportunities that would sort of allow for, I believe, potential recipients of tax credits to sort of extend the sunset dates, or at least that would influence the dates. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because right now we're very much, I think, in the mode of what are the good ideas that we can sort of chase down and figure out how to carry forward? So please.
Yeah, so it is a little wonky. So 25D is the residential solar tax credit. 48E is the commercial solar tax credit. But if you do third-party ownership, so if you don't own the system, but you either do a PPA or a lease, technically you're going to be using the 48 tax credit. So it's like not really a loophole, but it's essentially a way to have access to the tax credit for longer. The really great thing is because direct pay was not impacted, there's an opportunity. Previously, typically when you do third-party ownership, it's like through your solar developer, and you still could do that. But there are all these green banks that are now kind of popping up across the country that are really motivated to try to think about financing to get more renewable projects deployed. And so I think there's an opportunity to think about who are third-party owners that maybe are pretty aligned with trying to get the economics to pencil, and maybe they'll pass the full tax credit through to you. And so that was kind of what I was getting at with that offhand comment. So thank you for the follow-up.
Of course. Ethan, I'm going to come to you next. There's a question that actually I think you had indicated that you would like to respond to, but I'm going to tag it with something else that I was wondering if you could expand on. So the first question is about the rising electricity demand due to EVs, but later talking about how EV sales are expected to fall and have that battery sort of supply be able to be used by solar. And I'm wondering if you could respond to that. And then also, if you don't mind, you had also spoken about your base case and your upside case. It sounded like the main difference was the foreign entities of concern. Is that true? And do you see other avenues where the upside case could really be much more positive, considering other types of factors?
All right, let me try and answer this first one first. So the question was, I had said that that we think that there'll be more batteries available in 2030 because demand for electric vehicles will be lower. To be clear, lower than the sharp rate of growth that we and others in the industry had been projecting. So we were, before this legislation, we were expecting that EV sales were going to be tracking towards about 50% by the end of this decade, 50% of new car sales. Now we think you're going to be tracking more like towards 25%. But that 50% line was that not just because it was our number, but because a lot of others in the industry thought we were going to see that kind of growth. That's part of what drove a lot of that battery manufacturing investment that we've seen. And that's why we think that even though we do think EV sales are going to grow, they're just not going to grow as fast as they would. And therefore, we think you'll have some spare battery capacity overall, and that'll allow it make it more possible to meet some of these foreign entity of concern requirements on utility scale energy storage. Sorry, it's a long way to kind of answer, but it's a bit of a complicated set of circumstances overall. And now, Elizabeth, now that I've given you such an elaborate answer on that one, you're going to have to remind me the second question.
Sure, no problem. It was on the base case versus your upside case. And it sounded as though it was mostly FIAC, but I'm just curious if there's anything else that you see that could nudge that upside case up, which is what we're in the business of trying to brainstorm today.
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, we tried in our base case to be fairly conservative. If you read the White House's executive order that came out 3 days after the legislation was passed, it seemed pretty clear that they were very intent on sort of making it more challenging for folks to hurry up and get things under construction and in qualification and meeting the requirements of either not having to deal with FIAC or dealing with the least aggressive versions of FIAC in the earlier years. And so that was the entire sort of preamble of the White House's executive order, which means that we generally think that what's coming from Treasury is going to be fairly challenging. It's unclear exactly what it would be. There could be some requirements around disclosure that could make life very difficult for folks in the industry. And then there could be a revisiting of guidance issued by the IRS in 2013, which defined what under construction means and how long it takes to get yourself completed. Basically, the IRS said if you put 5% money down, essentially, or you demonstrate materially that you're operating to get under construction, that you're actually showing continuous operations in terms of building, you have 4 years to get done. And we think that that could get potentially revisited.
Okay, thanks. Mayor McLean, I'd love to ask you, this is a great question for you. What do cities need to be asking themselves to determine if geothermal is right for them?
That is a great question. It's going to require me to think for a moment. I mean, what I found in talking with other cities is you've got to have willing partners. So do you have partners that would be interested in looking at this with you? Is this something that you are willing as a leader in your own community to pilot out, test, determine the feasibility, and then lean into it? And is it something that would be embraced by your residents, I think, are some of the kind of like engagement questions to ask. And then, of course, there's the technical questions. So I'd look to organizations like Geothermal Rising to help you determine whether or not there's feasibility to use. You know, a lot of Midwestern and East Coast cities are looking at using, drilling down deep and then using it as power to power heat pumps for cooling. Our system is a little different because it's direct source and it's hot water. We ask ourselves too, as we're looking at how we extend it, the financial piece. And so right now, given the changes in the IRA and the kind of tax, the direct pay and then windows for investment, I think an important question is this something we could actually fit in time-wise and investment-wise that makes sense to use now, given all the other constraints that have been built and put up against using solar, wind, and other things into the future, or some of them. But I would just call out organizations like Geothermal Rising that are there to help figure out if the policy framework, the landscape from which you're working, and then help you figure out the next steps of what to try.
And I'm going to follow up with another question that's targeted to you, Mayor McLean, which is about the 100% clean energy and sort of how you've engaged the utility and other partners you've found around the community, particularly when it comes to some of the private sector partners who might be very well aligned with your goals, the city's goals, and sort of how to make sure that that coalition sort of presses that forward.
Sure. I was on the city council when I advanced the 100% clean electricity goals that we have. So we have 2 levels of goals, both clean electricity and then carbon neutral goals. And so as a city, we said city government by 2030, we want to be powered by 100% clean electricity. We're on track to meet that goal. We'll likely beat it, which is exciting. And then we would take the learnings and do the same citywide by 2035. And then for our carbon neutral goals, which I did advance once elected in 2020, it's city government by 2035, and then citywide by 2050. So we've got those different tiers. Working with the utility is a must. And so when at the city, we were looking at, and I was pushing the 2030 goal for city government, the power company, we were having conversations with the power company at the same time. Idaho Power set their goal of 2040. And I said, okay, we're going to put ours ahead of you. And we're one of your largest customers, so we're going to help you meet your goal of 2040 if you'll help me meet my goal of 2030. And it's been a great partnership. We negotiated using corporate partners, so Micron and Meta, the state's first power purchase agreement that then Idaho Power went and built solar that is now providing 100% clean electricity for the city airport in Boise and our water renewal facility, and then providing that same power that was needed by Meta and by Micron. So we've looked to that. And then you can't underestimate the power and impact that residents have as well. So Boiseans want to engage. We have a 97% recycling and compost rate in our city, which is high, and divert over 40% of our waste from the landfill. That's an example of what Boiseans want to do. But we need to provide, and now we're doing this, as much help and support for other avenues of activity to meet carbon neutral goals as well. And we've got a citizens advisory committee right now putting together what they would propose the city consider for public engagement and partnership to meet those goals. So we have both business support as well as residential support and those outlets for engagement so that we can all be rowing together and meet the 2030, 2035, and 2050 goals that we have. It's going to be tough, especially with this changing environment and the investment and the incentives that have changed. Meeting that carbon neutral goal is going to be tough. We are still on track for clean electricity, but recognizing, and when we wrote it, we knew it would be tough. There were things that we knew we could do, and we just had to trust that last 15 to 20% is going to be the hardest last 15 to 20%. By the time we get close to 2050, we'll have new technologies and ability to do it. And of course, we made so many more advancements than expected in the last 5 years, given the tax codes and financial incentives. We're back where we were, and I like to point out that we developed these plans in the last Trump administration before the IRA. So we're focused on figuring out how to do it without those.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present on this. I think clearly the impact of this bill is significant. But at the same time, there are a lot of opportunities that remain. There are a lot of partners who will remain focused on pushing this agenda forward. And we are very grateful to all of our partners as we try to pursue a path forward. We will be sharing a recording of this with those who registered for the event, for the webinar, and we'll be sending some other tools and kits and other things that we have to make sure that you can stay engaged. So thank you to everyone for joining.